Welcome to this week's edition of Aging with Attitude, a show that deals with topics that are of importance to senior citizens and people that are dealing with issues of later life. Again, my name is Keith Dennis. I'm your host this evening, and I'm happy to introduce to you this evening our guest, who is Dr. Zackary White, who is the Director of Graduate Programs at the Knight School of Communication at Queen's University of Charlotte. Dr. White, I'm happy that you could be here, and I would just like to have you tell me a little bit about yourself and the program that you're responsible for.
Sure, thanks so much for having me. My name is Dr. Zackary White, and I am the Director of Graduate Programs for the James L. Knight School of Communication at Queen's, and we have a Master of Arts in Communication program that addresses all kinds of communication issues. In particular, we address health communications issues, and over the past several years, I've had the opportunity to teach health communication classes that impact with the kinds of work and research that I'm interested in, that we also believe engages the community.
Well, now, how did you get interested in this topic in the first place?
All great topics start with a story, so I'll take you back what now is 12 years ago, and it's hard to believe it's been 12 years, but I think anyone who's in the viewing audience today will relate to the fact that it goes by very fast in retrospect. But it started about 12 years ago with my mother, who at the time was diagnosed with something inexplicable, and over a period of time, eventually the doctors realized that she had a malignant tumor. And she, like many millions of Americans, went through radiation, very intense radiation treatment, a 6-week program. And I was a PhD student in communication at Purdue University, and I had the rare opportunity to travel back west to spend time with my family, who was living in California, in particular with my mother and father. And I had the kind of front row view of what happens when someone that you love requires care. And during this very intensive radiation treatment of 6 weeks, you see things that you never think you're going to see. You see the kind of debilitating things that happens to a body under treatment, but with the hope that all of this will pay off in the end in terms of reducing the size of the tumor, extending life, and maybe a miracle will happen and she will live a life longer than was anticipated given the gravity and the intensity of the tumor. Well, I remember vividly going with her and my father, driving to the doctor's office at the end of those 6 weeks to find out the results. Did the radiation work? And it's one of those moments that you never forget, sitting in the waiting room, and in this moment, waiting not simply to find out something superficial, but really to find out whether or not my mother would live. And we're waiting in the waiting room, then go into the doctor's office. The neurologist comes in, and he puts up the x-rays for us to view, and there's the before picture of the tumor, and then the after picture had a tumor, many tumors littered throughout her brain. And that was the moment whereby the entire medical establishment disappeared in our lives. While they had provided great service up to that point and doing all that they could do, I'll never forget the neurologist saying, "This is as far as we can take it. There's nothing more that you can do. There might be some extreme experimental treatments, but it will require you to move here and there, and at most you'd have 2 or 3 months to add to your life." So at that point, the physical therapists, the experts, the medical establishment disappeared from our lives, and we had to make some difficult decisions as a family that we did not anticipate. And that's really the genesis of the notion of the unprepared caregiver. I, like many millions of Americans, was unprepared for the fact that my mother, she was 52 at the time, had a matter of months to live. At that point, with end-of-life care, hospice began coming into our home, and that really made me think about end-of-life issues in ways that as a young man in his 20s did not think about before. But more importantly, I started to think about what it meant for me, someone who I was getting my PhD in communication. I was near the end of my program at a very prestigious program, and I did not know how to handle, nor communicate, nor make sense of the experiences that were going on. So that's the genesis of the Unprepared Caregiver, a website, a free resource now that I provide for people. And it started there, and I was mesmerized by the fact that the only people that came into our home upon the terminal diagnosis, and you can only go into hospice when you are diagnosed with typically 3 months or less to live. The only people who willingly came into our home were hospice workers and hospice volunteers. And not only did that change the trajectory of my life, of course, to watch my mother begin the process of dying, but it also changed what I felt was important in life and what I wanted to study in terms of I wanted to know who were these people that would walk into homes when dying began, and why is it as a culture we are so fearful, frightful, and there's such a stigma associated with death and dying in America.
Well, again, for our audience, what you're sharing or about to share with us, it seems to me is extremely important, because I would wager that many people that watch our show have had exactly the same experience over the years. And again, I do know that there's been a great deal of progress in these past 15, 20 years in terms of doing a better job of conveying and communicating the idea that, I guess, life is terminal, and that there at some point in time we all have to face that issue. But I guess if you can just maybe bring us up to speed of what's been happening in the last 15, 20 years to make this situation better.
Well, yeah, I think we need to go back to take a look briefly at caregiving in the 20th century versus caregiving in the 21st century. And we have been blessed with incredible advances in medical technology. In terms of extension of life, we are living longer, but the trade-off with that is that we are living chronic lives. And let me just for a few minutes, if I could, share with your audience some of the factors that I think are challenging in terms of how we make sense of end-of-life issues and also caregiving issues. When we talk about dying, this taboo subject, this stigmatized subject, I think we can think about it culturally, because as I was going through that experience, I was individually experiencing what I thought was something radically unique. And I think anyone who goes through that experience thinks that. But there are certain commonalities that are cut across all diseases and all illness trajectories when we're talking about dying and death in America. In particular, I think that Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex, and what I like to call is that we live in the midst of a health recovery complex. If we take a look at the 20th century and we think about the types of illnesses that were prevalent, we're talking mostly about acute illnesses. And I like to think about acute illnesses in this way. They are short of duration. They're tangible to the extent that they can be more easily diagnosed. And it's something you will call the ambulance for. I was on the drive over here, and there was fire engine and an ambulance. And it was very clear when you pull over to the side of the road that there's something wrong and there's someone going to be taken care of. And typically, where do they go? They go to the hospital. So in these situations, these acute situations, there's a clear beginning to the illness and there's a clear ending to the illness. And it's steeped in the curative model. The goal is cure. And while this is an amazing model, what we're moving away from is this acute model because of better diagnoses and the ability to extend life in ways in the 21st century that we've never before experienced. All of us are living longer, and we're very grateful for that. But there are some communication challenges that associate with that kind of chronic shift in the 21st century. When we talk about chronic illness, we talk about something that you live with for a long period of time. We're talking about something moving away from the cure-based model to a palliative-based or comfort-based model. Right. And so from hypertension to heart disease to Alzheimer's to cancer, across the spectrum of illnesses, we're living in a chronic age. And while we have made the shift medically and biomedically from an acute model to a chronic care model, I think we are just starting to think about some of the communication-related issues, how it affects the caregiver, how it affects the family system, and how we think and talk about these issues has to change because the illness itself requires it. And so I think, in terms of the most important difference is recognizing that an acute model illness, for example, you will be able to more articulately share with others something is happening, we're moving toward a recovery. And those around you are more able to identify, participate, send a sympathy card, Typically with an acute model, in terms of communication issues, you only need to disclose what's going on with your loved one once. This happened, they're going in for surgery, this happened, we hope that they will be better at this point, they're in physical rehabilitation. So there's a model, that trajectory of rehabilitation, or the move or push towards cure. Let me ask you or your viewers, you probably face a situation whereby in a chronic care situation, there is no end point in sight. There is no cure by which you can clearly state or share with others when it will be over. And so you find yourself as a caregiver not able to communicate what's going on or the experiences that you're facing in the same way that you would in the acute model. So I think those are the kind of the biggest differences in terms of how we think about illness. And in terms of dying and death in America, I think that we still are steeped in the acute model in terms of how we think about dying. Going back to my personal situation, going inside someone's home is a traumatic experience for those on the outside, in terms of, if you know you're going to visit someone who's getting better, what do? You bring flowers, you bring food, and you are able to celebrate in the idea that you're going to be able to talk about when life will return to normal. But think about what happens when you contemplate going into someone's home to visit them, let alone care for them, when you know there will not be a future by which you can share, that you know it's indeterminate, that you know better is not necessarily in the realm of vocabulary. And so I think this is a major issue that keeps a lot of people from approaching, from caregiving, from contemplating what to say, how do I say it, I'm so uncertain, I don't want to make a fool out of myself, I don't want to intimidate the other person, I don't want to be depressed. I mean, you think about the synonyms that go with death in this culture and dying, it's almost always associated with something that is depressing, right, something that is to be avoided.
Well, one of the things that, as you were talking about, again, I think all of our audience has had some experience with this situation, and one of the things, especially with my father-in-law, it's like, I think he knew he was not going to get better. He was afraid of how it would feel for us, and he was basically trying to be very stoic.
Right.
We were trying to be cheerful, and again, at some point in time, at that point, this was a number of years ago, no one was there giving us clues as how to do this. So we basically sat with a very pensive and not really talking with one another. We were in the room, and maybe that was good,
right,
but we weren't really talking with one another.
Right.
So is that sort of some of the things that you're training? And I guess maybe my next question is, who are you training when you're in this program?
Well, a lot of my research has to do with those kinds of people who engage in end-of-life communication industries. So, for example, I do a lot of research surrounding hospice workers. These are people who are trained to enter into context when dying begins. And it is very contrary or antithetical to what most of us would think or know. In fact, it's called, it's often associated with dirty work. And for your audience, let me just explain what dirty work is. It's work that is tainted in a variety of ways by perception. And for example, some may believe hospice workers are tainted because of the fact that they work with bodies. And so most people, when you work with bodies, that's something I can't do. You must be a special person. They're also morally and socially tainted in part from those on the outside, because you think about what they're doing. They're not only working with bodies, they're working with subjects that, like you mentioned with your father-in-law, deal directly with issues that are taboo, that we don't know how to talk about, that we don't want to talk about. We do a tremendous job in this culture avoiding topics directly addressing death and dying, because it's something that is taboo, because in large part the irony is that science has made so many advances that we believe that it is not going to come to us, that we can continuously put it off. And it's often associated with a failure, a lack of desire to live, a life that is not lived well. You made bad choices about how you're going to live. So there's still that 20th century stigma on chronic illness. These workers are also going inside people's homes, which, you deal with the informal context and rules of how to act in the company of others rather than a public site like a hospital. Most of us are more familiar and comfortable with going to a hospital because it's a public site. We can get in and out. We don't have to go through the gatekeepers, the familiar images of photos that remind us who that person was. So a lot of my research is about understanding, for example, why hospice volunteers amongst the general population would willingly choose to enter into context of death and dying. And it's interesting, in my in-depth interviews with hospice volunteers, we may think it's a depressing volunteer role. They would say something to the contrary. They find it one of the most uplifting things that they can do. In large part, they have different frames that orient them to that work differently. And likewise with hospice nurses who have to deal with the very fragile, complex interpersonal relationships and the palliative care model and hospice model, which values a team-based approach. So they're looking at issues of comfort care, not necessarily cure-based models. So they will empower patients to make decisions. They will empower family members. They sometimes have to defer their own expertise to what family members want. That may be contrary to what's best in terms of comfort models. Sure. So in large part, the goal of my research is to help illuminate these professions whereby what can we learn as outsiders in terms of how and why people orient themselves differently to death and dying than common perception. And what is it specifically that they are seeing or understanding in their repeated experiences with death and dying that most of us don't experience until we are drafted into the situation. Death and dying in chronic caregiving is a rite of passage in the 21st century. In particular, there are 157 million Americans by the year 2020 will have a chronic illness themselves.
Say that again. I think
157 million Americans will have a chronic illness themselves by the year 2020. If you do the numbers, that's about half of our country's population. So your viewing audience out there and every one of us, whatever your age. And so the stereotypes of this is only a woman's role, this is only someone who's older is going to face this, I don't have to worry about it. That's not the situation that people are facing today. We know people in our lives who have a chronic illness who will require care and caregiving in ways that we did not conceive of in the 20th century, whereby we outsourced it, whereby we were living in a different kind of social situation, whereby we were surrounded by extended family. And so I think what we're experiencing now is kind of a shift, a paradigm shift, and having to come to grips with what that means. So chronic caregiving compels us all to think about the intersections of care across life. A lot of my other research has to do with the intersection of work and care and how we negotiate some of those tensions.
All right. Now, one of the things that I'd like to have you talk about, again, we're talking about communicating this idea of death and dying and chronic illnesses. How would you say would be the best way for our audience to get this kind of dialogue going where we can start feeling more comfortable? Can you address some of those?
I think the first piece of advice I would say is don't start when someone has the chronic illness. So, if you have to, you have to. But these kinds of conversations typically come up only out of necessity. And if you believe that it's not going to happen to you, it makes sense only to bring these conversations up out of necessity. But I want to kind of remind all of us that we will all be drafted as caregivers at some point in our lives. And not only will care affect what happens between you and your loved one, we're all unprepared. That's kind of the overarching message that I have, is that no one ever is fully prepared when you care for someone that you love. The idea that you have to see them in a different state, that it changes how you respond to them. It changes how you think about your other aspects of your own life. Most of caregivers feel isolated and alone, and in many cases, the burden falls upon one or two people in the family. But let me just take a context like working caregivers. I mean, this notion that, caregiving is something that impacts all of our lives. And 70% of working caregivers today express challenges in terms of articulating how their caregiving responsibilities impact their work in some capacity. 28% of those 70% believe that people at work don't know what's going on in their lives. And I only bring this up because life, our life is in many ways our work. for many of us. And to think that these very caregiving issues are not being talked about, discussed, or disclosed in the workplace, or people don't know how to disclose in the workplace, impacts not only what happens on the job, it impacts what happens in the home. And it's called spillover. The idea that we cannot compartmentalize our care. Our care injects itself into all aspects of our lives in terms of what we find to be important, what we value, what we think we can do, our levels of burnout and stress, and caregivers' own physiological well-being have all been shown to be correlated with caregiving responsibilities. And so one of the classes I taught last summer in the Master of Arts program at Queen's in particular was examining how working caregivers disclose their caregiving responsibilities. And there's a theory in communication called communication privacy management. And in other words, how do we decide what to share and with whom? And I wish there was a handbook by which we could go to page 78 and say, when this is happening to you, this is who you can share it with, and this is who you cannot share it with, and these are the reasons why. But we know that's much more complex because our lives are multifaceted. So what this theory helps us understand are the factors that determine what we share and to whom we share. Context matters. If you believe that in your workplace you will be sharing that information will be used against you, more likely than not you will not share that. But we also know that sharing caregiving responsibilities or private issues like what you're doing in your caregiving time is important in terms of developing those peer-to-peer relationships at work. And so these are the very things, if we are able to share at work, we're more likely to be aligned with our peer group at work and more identified with our organization. And so these are some of the kinds of pressing issues that I think organizations need to pay attention to. The idea that caregiving will not happen amongst their workers is silly, naive, and I think will be counterproductive, as I think the cachet going forward will be how do organizations acknowledge this and provide resources that are important for caregivers. But in terms of what we share, it's what are you willing others to co-own? Are you willing to reveal that your father has Alzheimer's and it affects how, there will be impact in terms of how you interpret the everyday experiences of your workplace. More often than not, working caregivers are, in essence, paranoid about how their caregiving will affect what happens at work. And that goes against the stigma that a caregiver will be a less productive worker. There's not necessarily a correlation with that.
Right. Well, again, it's extremely apropos that we're talking about this topic. Again, some of the things that I'm concerned about as I look at caregivers, because I know that it also happens in the military under other circumstances, that there's so much opportunity for burnout, both at the family level and I'm sure for the people that are providing those services and the caring relationships that they're responsible for. Again, burnout. It sounds like we're going to be dealing with chronic issues for a long time.
And burnout is one of those issues that is part and parcel of the chronic illness caregiving responsibilities. With an acute care responsibility, it's a shorter duration. So we're talking, as you say, about inevitable caregiver burnout. And so the challenge becomes not necessarily how do we eliminate burnout as much as how do we provide resources and opportunities for people to manage their burnout. And some of the choices in terms of how are different than when I faced this issue in 2002. I mean, that's eons ago. Now we have things like social media. We have different tools available to us. We have things like Caring Bridge. And what we're currently researching is how do people most effectively use these different mediums of communication to communicate to particular audiences?
Okay, for our audience that might not know, could you just talk a little bit about what is Caring Bridge? That's something.
Yeah, Caring Bridge is a site that's available for people to disclose their caregiving responsibilities to a group of people that you discern, and you can make it open access or you can choose amongst the various audiences that have access to that. So what it does is it reduces the burnout. I'll take myself back to 2002. I was responsible for calling our social network and letting them know when my mom was in surgery, the implications of her terminal diagnosis, and when she died. And the incredible burnout that you experience as a result of that, I will remember vividly. The more I talked about my mother had died in trying to relay this information to those we cared about, it started becoming less and less personal to me. It was almost as I was reciting something that was far away from me. We have resources and tools in terms of technological mediums that now allow us to do that in a different way, although I think we need training in terms of what medium is appropriate for what audiences and how do you express it. I mean, it's different expressing care via email versus Twitter versus Caring Bridge versus texting someone. And so this is where my research is going in terms of disclosure patterns. How do we allow people to participate in caregiving along the way to reduce the likelihood of burnout, as you talk about? Because it is caregiving at the end is an alienating, isolating experience. But if we're more proactive with it, we can be aware of these issues as we go forward in trying to care for those we care most about.
Right. Well, now, as somebody who's older and not too tuned into the communication, some of the things that you're talking about are things that I can see that our audience that watch our show are going to likely have to be tuned into what those options are and basically shown how to reach that. Is that true, or what sort of things are?
Yeah, in terms of training for some of those tools, and also training in terms of what we in the night school at Queens call digital and media literacy. And so some of the workshops I'm working on are how do we help both those who are going through illness and also their caregivers. More likely than not, their caregivers will be people like me in the sandwich generation who are caring for their parents and also for their own children. And so it's that dialogue about who do you want to know? How do you best want to get this material across? At what point? And every person and family has to negotiate those privacy boundaries amongst themselves. If you don't do that in advance, it will be determined beyond your control.
Well, we're getting toward the end of our program. Is there anything that you'd like to summarize?
Sure. I just want to say quickly, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to caregivers, and I also want to draw your attention to unpreparedcaregiver.com as a free website with incredible resources that I provided that deal with many of the issues that we talked about today and allow people, caregivers, to have access to common experiences that they may face during this time.
Well, you all have been watching the Aging with Attitude show. We've been talking with Dr. Zackary White. And again, this topic applies so much to so many of us. And again, while AARP may always be looking at living a life well, and that's what we're all about, we have this issue of chronic illness that we're all going to be facing. And again, with your help and people like yourself, we will face this in the future with hope and optimism, at least in terms of knowing that we're doing the right things.